Welcome to My First Boat. In this channel we will show you the step-by-step restoration of our 40-foot vintage steel yacht, with the goal to someday living on it full time. Yeah, maybe it's not that Battle of Berlin, but it sure was a battle. And I will tell you all about it, but first, let's get into the engine room and do some more engine testing. Just like before, the engine started right away after a single turn of the starter motor. But then it stopped after about 10 seconds, and when we couldn't get it to start again, we figured there must be air in the fuel line. Here you can see me pumping fuel manually. But even after many tries, it still wouldn't start. We then proceeded with bleeding the fuel system by opening certain screws which are specifically meant to let air out from the fuel line. And once all the air was out of the fuel line, she started without a problem again. First, I checked the old exhaust pipe and muffler to see if there's any exhaust gases coming out. And I didn't notice anything unusual. The propeller is turning even though the gearbox is in neutral. That's presumably because the transmission fluid is cold and makes the clutch stick. Just listen how quiet it runs. At idle speed you can hardly hear it at all. Happy to see some of the gauges are working. By the way, if you are interested in how we prepared the engine for this test, you can find that part at the end of this video. Here I put the gearbox in reverse and then back to neutral. Right now, let's move on to the battlefield, where we start preparing for our first offensive. This was a big job, spread over several days, and I covered it in detail, so buckle up, because it's gonna be a bumpy ride. Note how nice and clean everything looks on the surface at first glance. Alright, first, let's start by removing those old ceiling panels. And please, don't tell me that I should have kept them to use as templates later. It just doesn't work that way here. The glass wool surrounding the hatch was completely soaked. Here are some more signs of moisture. Now let's carefully remove those wooden frames. And luckily there's some plastic foil holding back the glass wool. This is quite tedious work, but luckily they come off quite easily. Next, let's slowly work ourselves through to the glass wool itself. And for this, of course, I'm wearing a full bodysuit, so I don't bring home any of those glass wool fibers. I noticed that the entire wooden structure of the ceiling here was not nailed or screwed down, but merely pressed in place. Which made the removal quite easy, to be frank. Here you see a perfect example why, with this boat, you can't just remove one part of a room, for example just the ceiling or just the side panels, because everything is built on top of each other and for the most part nailed or glued together. So if you want to get to a certain area, you most likely have to remove everything. Here I'm documenting how the frames of the doors were built, so that later on I can use this as inspiration if I have to build my own. And for now, this too has to go. Here you can see in one of the corners how the wood is completely rotten away. And the scary part is that when we first bought the boat, this was completely hidden behind those panels. So if you ever buy a used boat, make sure you check for those things, because apparently boats tend to rot from the inside out. And by the time you see it on the surface, it may be too far gone and you're gonna have to remove everything, just like me here. Now we start to get a first glimpse of the damage that has occurred here over the years, and I'll give you a summary on this in a moment, but first let's continue by removing more stuff. Whew, I need a break. Let's watch a quick clip of how I cut to fit one of the new floorboards for the forward cabin. First, let's take some rough measurements here. Then cut this away with a jigsaw and a metal saw blade. Take it back down to make some marks on where to cut the grooves for those vertical flat bars. First I drill a hole. And then open up the rest with the jigsaw. Let's see if it fits. There you go. Alright, nice little distraction, but now let's get back into the trenches where we have a job to finish. Now we are working towards an area which is one of the most heavily affected by rust and decay. So let's remove all this paneling so we can see the entire extent of the damage. And here we see the root cause of the water damage, at least in this corner. This draining pipe coming from the roof has rusted through and through, leading all the rainwater from the roof straight into the boat. Here another vestige of the old shipyard, but I couldn't make any sense of the notes on this board. Here another example where wood has turned into something with the consistency of cake. I'm surprised this held together this long at all. I really want to keep this seating area, at least for a little while, so here I'm getting access to the wood panels behind. Ah, what the heck. and this is where it all ends up. Alright, moving on, and don't worry, we're almost done. Here I'm removing the paneling of the areas underneath the windows, aft and forward. Wait a second, let's watch that again more slowly. Do you see this? Oh, that's where I left those pliers, is what the shipbuilder from 43 years ago is thinking now. And they're good ones too. Here's a tool which I bought some 3 years ago and never used once. Today is its big moment to shine. Moving on the other side. Here we are right in front of the steering wheel. Finally, let's remove those panels around the windows. Here's a stamp on a wooden panel from a company which today apparently sells kitchens. Alright, now it's time to assess the total damage, and I have to tell you, it's not good. At this point I have no idea how to properly fix this, because the most heavily rusted areas are tucked into very tight corners. Now on the positive side, we also learned something. Here you can see several areas where the steel has rusted through and through, unnoticed and undisturbed by anyone for years on end, because it was covered by insulation and panels from both sides, with no way to check and notice if any water comes in, until of course it is too late. All I can do for now is to try and remove the largest chunks with an angle grinder and a steel brush, and then let's see next week what we're gonna do about this. And while we're at it, let's remove those old DC wires. Alright, we are now back on another day with fresh energy, and after all this tearing down, ready to build something up again. So let's tackle this old hatch. First, let's see how the new loomer hatch fits. Here too, because the ceiling is slightly arched, we're gonna have to build some kind of a frame. Also, the corners have a different radius, so we're gonna have to grind some material away there first. Let's create a little working space. Perfect, nice and roomy. We'll start by cleaning up the borders and then grind away some material to adjust the radius of the corners. Now that the corners fit, we can see what other areas we have to work on. For sure we need to weld in some steel on the sides and also on the rear. This time I decided to take a slightly different approach, which I'm gonna show you in a moment, but first I cut the pieces which I'm gonna weld in later. Then I remove the paint in preparation for the welding later on, and then clean everything and put some rust converter oil on it. After letting this cure overnight, we come back the next day. Here now, the slightly different approach which I mentioned earlier. I put the hatch down in the right position and then add those new pieces of steel in the place where they belong. I make sure from underneath that everything is aligned properly before I commence with the welding. And then I weld the pieces into place with the hatch sitting on them, hoping that like this I will get them level with the hatch right away. And I'm not gonna make any continuous welds here, because that will most likely just result in the steel bending. Plus like this it's easy to remove if sometime in the future that should be necessary. Right, now let's make the piece to cover up the gap in the rear. Once again, I put the hatch down, then position everything properly from underneath and trace a line on where to cut. On with the cutting. I cut both borders of the steel to a wedge to provide some space for the weld to go in. This is now ready for welding. Because the piece I welded in was quite narrow, it bended at some point. So here I'm taking care of that. And these are my welds of the day. Not the best, not the worst, just good enough for this. Now let's close those welds from underneath and then we're done with that. One small thing left to do is to close those gaps here in the corners. And that's where we are at with this at the end of this week. Right, now let me show you what we did to prepare the engine for this test. First we pumped out the old oil, which conveniently can be done with this hand pump here at the rear of the engine. Altogether we pumped out about 7 liters of engine oil. Double check to see if it's really empty. Next we remove the old oil filter. Prep the new one and screw it in. And in case you're wondering which one we used, there you have it. Now we can fill in the new engine oil. Check to make sure that it's at the right level. And the rest is history. And that's everything that happened in week 26. We are now 4 weeks away from getting this boat into the water if everything goes according to plan. So make sure you don't miss any of it. And meet us again right here next week.